Hi everyone. In this mini lecture, I'm going to be discussing a problem that should help you with problem number 9 on the exam. So in this problem, we're going to take a modification of the problem number 1 from Project Euler. So in this one, we're going to define a function or define two functions. The first one is going to return the count of the multiples of 3 or 5 from the number list that's inputted. And the next one that we define will return the sum of the multiples of 3 or 5 from that list. So as an example, if you have the list 10, 2, 9, 7, 1, 21, 19, 16, 5, 45, the number of multiples of 3 or 5 is going to be 5 because there's 10, there's 9, there's 21, there's 5, and there's 45. On the other hand, the sum of the multiples will be 90 because if you add 10, 9, 21, 5, and 45, you'll get 90. Okay, so here are the two lines that are going to test our two functions. And the only difference between the sum of the multiples and the count of the multiples function is going to be what we do when the number is a multiple of 3 or 5. So when the number is a multiple of 3 or 5, in the sum of the multiples, we're going to add that number. In the count of the multiples, we're going to just add 1. Okay, so let's fill in the rest of the blanks. And again, you can and you should always draw a table to see what's going on. So if you draw the table and you have the relationship that the accumulator, so we'll draw our accumulator, and again, we'll just comment this out. So you have your accumulator column and you have your item column. Okay, and we have to figure out what the relationship is between the item and the accumulator. So here the item, since we're using range, is going to be the positions of the numbers from numList. So first of all, what we're going to go over for the items, we're going to start it at 0, that's the 0th position, and we're going to end it at the length of the list. So again, its range is going to stop 1 before that. The last number in numList is at position numList.length minus 1, so we add 1 to that to get numList.length. Okay, so item is going to start at 0 here, and remember, first row, second column is going to be the first item in our list. So since this is a list with a range, it's going to start with whatever we give as this first input to range. And the accumulator, so let's say that in this case, the sum of the multiples of 3 or 5 from the list, we're going to make the accumulator be the sum of the items in that list before the item at this index. So when we do 0, when we start with 0, we want the sum before index 0. And again, there are no numbers in the list before index 0. So we say that's the empty list, and we start the sum at 0. Okay, as I mentioned before, you won't always start the accumulator at 0. If you were doing a product, for instance, an empty product, you'd be starting at 1. And if you were doing, let's say, a minimum, you would start an empty minimum at infinity. Right? Because if you take infinity, if you take the minimum of infinity and any number, any actual number, it'll just be that number. If you take the sum of 0 and any number, it'll just be that number. If you take the product of 1 and that number, it'll just be that number. So the point is to make it so that whatever operation we're going to be doing, in this case adding, should, when we add the first number in the list or multiply the first number in the list, or take the minimum of the first item of the list and the starting accumulator, we should always get that number in the list if that's what we want the accumulator to be in the second row. So the accumulator here in the second row is going to be the sum of the multiples of 3 or 5 before index 1. So for this list itself, we'd want the accumulator to be 10 at this point. And the reason we want the accumulator to be 10 is because 10 is a multiple of 3 or 5. So this should be 10 when item is 1. 1 is the next item in range, right? Because we're going over the indices. And then when we get to this next number of 2, we still want the accumulator to be 10. So when we take when item is 2, we're going to want the accumulator to be the sum of the items before this index of 2 that are multiples of 3 or 5. But since 2 is not a multiple of 3 or 5, we're going to want to keep the accumulator 10. And then we have our next one here, right? So when we're at index 3, when item is 3, we're going to want the sum of the multiples of 3 or 5 before index 3. So here 9 is a multiple of 3 or 5. It's a multiple of 3. So we're going to want to add that to our existing accumulator, or our current accumulator. So this is going to become 19. Item is 3. Then the next one, 7, is not a multiple of 3 or 5. So we will keep it at 19. Okay, so once you see this pattern, again, the starting accumulator, the thing that's in the first row, first column, is what we're going to be putting the starting with ACC of. Okay, and in this case, what we could see is to get from one accumulator to the next, it depends on whether the item at that index, so here our item is our index, and you could tell by, again, that second input that we pass to repeat for every item and show steps. So here, the accumulator is going to depend upon whether the item at that index is a multiple of 3 or 5 or not. So how we change the accumulator is going to depend on whether that number at that index is 3 or 5 or not. So that's why in the thing that we repeat, we have an if and an else. So what we say is if, like what actually determines the condition of whether this stays the same or goes up by the number that's at that index. Well, we wanted to see if that number was a multiple of 3 or 5. So we're not going to say, so first let me write, this would say that the number index is divisible by 3 or index is divisible by 5, but we do not want this because remember, index is going to be 0 and then 1 and then 2 and then 3. We're not asking if the index is divisible by 3 or the index is divisible by 5. We're asking if the number in numList at that index is divisible by 3 or 5. So remember, index is going to be 0 and then it's going to be 1 and then it's going to be 2. When it's 0, we want the 10. When it's 1, we want the 2. When it's 2, we want the 9. When it's 3, we want the 7, etc. So to get that, we have to say numList of index. So when 0 is substituted for index, it'll be numList of 0, and numList right now will be this list here, 10, 2, 9, 7, 1, 21, 19, 16, 5, 45, and so if we do numList of 0, numList of 0 is going to be replaced with 10. So 10% 3 equals 0 is false, but if we do that percent 5, so numList of 0 is 10, if we do 10% 5, so the remainder when you divide by 10 by 5, that is going to be 0, right? So this whole thing, this if, the condition in this if will be true because for a condition that's with an or in it to be true, you just need one of them to be true. So the second one is true, so the whole thing will be true. So in that case, what did we say we wanted to do to go from one accumulator to the next? We want to take the accumulator and add the number. So again, this is really just modeling what we're doing. If I gave you a list of numbers and I asked you to give me the sum of all those numbers that are divisible by 3 or 5, I would start going through the list, right? So I would go and give you that 0th number in the list, and right now you're thinking of a sum of 0, and when I give you 10, you're like, okay, that's a multiple, you're checking if that's a multiple of 3 or 5, it is, so you will add 10, and you'll say, okay, now I'm thinking of 10, and now I give you that next number at index 1, and at index 1 it's 2, and you're saying is 2 a multiple of 3 or 5? It's not. So I'm keeping my accumulator of 10. This condition is false, so it's going to do the else, which keeps the accumulator the same. And then when I give you 2, I'm not really giving you 2, I'm giving you the position of the item. So again, I'm just giving you 9 in this case. So when I give you 9, you're going to ask, is that 9 a multiple of 3 or 5? And it is, so you're going to add 9 to your current sum of 10 to get 19. And then when I give you that next item at index 3, 7, you're still going to be thinking 19. So really what this is doing, or how you form this table, think of this table, and the way we set this up is that I am giving you the item at this index. You have already stored, you're already keeping track of the sum of the multiples of 3 or 5 before this number. This is the current number. You have not accounted for it yet. You have not accounted for the number at index 2 yet. So I give you that number, and then once I give you that number, you're going to update your accumulator. If it's a multiple of 3 or 5, you're going to add that number, and if it's not, you're going to keep the accumulator the same. That's what this table is modeling, and again, you don't have to do it that way. You can make it so that the accumulator is the sum of the multiples of 3 or 5 up to and including that index, as we've discussed in other videos before. But again, this is, I think, the most straightforward way of understanding it, and when you write your code, I think it'll be the most straightforward. So we're doing it this way. Okay, so again, the index that I'm giving you, or the item here, the accumulator is the sum of the items before that. You're basically waiting for this number before you're updating the accumulator. Okay, so count of the multiples of 3 or 5 is going to be exactly the same, except whenever you see a number that's a multiple of 3 or 5, when you're counting, you say, okay, if I see this 10, I say, okay, my count was 0, now it's 1. Now I say 2, not a multiple of 3 or 5, so I'm still keeping it 1. 9, okay, it's a multiple of 3, so I'm bumping up my counter by 1, right? Not 9, you're just bumping up the counter by 1, so you're just adding 1, so that becomes 2. So each time, so all of these stay the same. So we'll fill this in with 0, numList.length. Could just copy and paste this. Numlist index percent 3 equal 0, or numlist index percent 5 equal 0. Again, you should include spaces. I'm not, because when you fill in the answers, you can't, or it'll mark you wrong. And in this case, I'm going to bump up the accumulator by 1, or otherwise I'm keeping it the same, and the starting with accumulator is still 0. So if I run this code, you see that you get the 90 for the first answer and get 5 for the count. Okay, so that's the solutions, and that's all.